Good afternoon. My name is Mark Rusin, and I will be moderating this afternoon's panel, which you all, I'm sure, know the title of More Americans Believe in Ghosts Than in Darwin. And for the recording, it's panel number 4314. We're excited to have three speakers with us this afternoon. Unfortunately, our fourth speaker couldn't make it, but we'll have an announcement about an event later today that involves her work. But we have three panelists who are going to get into the issue. We're going to do some introductions here that I'll provide. They'll have a discussion, 5 to 7 minute opening statement amongst the three of them, for each of them. Perhaps have some questions and dialogue with the panelists, and then we'll open up the conversation to Q&A from the audience. For those who have been attending panels this week, you'll be familiar with the statement regarding Q&A and how Q&A is going to work. Like other CWA sessions, we will utilize both the CWA app and a note card system to receive questions from the audience. What's great about the app is that you can ask questions while the panelists are speaking, so you don't necessarily have to wait until the Q&A session to ask your questions. Just open up the app, select this session, and tap Q&A, and you'll be able to insert questions into the app, and they'll come directly to this laptop. You may also raise your hand to request a note card, and one of the producers will get you a note card and a pencil. If you are a student, please note that in your questions, because we are going to prioritize student questions this afternoon. And just so everyone in the audience knows, having done this half a dozen times in the past, questions tend to come in themes, and my job as the moderator will be to try to circle the questions into themes, and I'll ask variations of questions that capture the themes that are being expressed by the audience. We'll likely get questions, a lot of questions around the same topic, and I'll try to formulate those into a single question. But do know all the questions are being read and assessed before they're asked of the panelists. I'll start off with a quick introduction. Please, if you go to the conference guidebook, you can get the full detailed bio for all of our panelists. So I'll just give you a few highlights. We'll start with Jerry Mikulski. During his dozen years as a tech industry trends analysis, Mikulski discovered he didn't like the word consumer, and staying mindful of this insight informed his next 2 decades and gave him the relationship economy thesis. Consumer mass marketing capitalism is falling over and will be fixed or replaced by a rediscovery of relationships and trust. Existing examples of this shift include Wikipedia, microlending, the internet, and open source software. Mikulski was raised in South America and publishes his brain online, jerrysbrain.com, no comma, just clear. Adam Frank is a professor of astrophysics at the University of Rochester. I should have mentioned that Jerry is the founder of REX, by the way. Adam is a professor of astrophysics at the University of Rochester, where his computational astrophysics group studies the origin and evolution of stars and planets. Along with his research, Adam describes himself as an evangelist of science, and his commitment to showing others the beauty and power of science has led him to a second career as a popular writer and speaker. He is the author of the upcoming book, Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds, and the Fate of the Earth. Something we should all read.
Is it thumbs up or thumbs
right,
down?
Exactly.
Too early to tell.
Can you cut to the chase?
Everybody can breathe again.
It's the LDR version.
And our third panelist is Michael Johnson. Michael is an assistant professor in immunobiology at the University of Arizona and the Bio5 Institute at the University of Arizona, to be specific, where he studies different ways of killing antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Helpful for saving the world, no doubt. He received his PhD in biochemistry and biophysics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. After completing his dissertation in ways bacteria move and attach to cause infection, he went to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital to do 2 postdoctoral fellowships. While at St. Jude, Johnson was heavily involved in science outreach, including starting a podcast called Science Soundbites, a science interview series designed to supplement STEM for middle and high school teachers and their students. And at the University of Arizona, Johnson continues to be an advocate for science through blogging, scientific talks, and social media, and attending events like the Conference on World Affairs. So welcome to all of our panelists, and we look forward to your comments, a little dialogue, and then we'll move to audience Q&A. Who would like to start?
Just go in that direction.
I guess that's me.
I guess so easy for Adam to say.
Happy to. Very happy to be on this panel. So sorry Naomi's not here. First, she's a hero of mine. Second, she's turned us into a mantle, which I'd like to not be on mantles. So apologies up front for that having happened. Next year, I think you're going to have drones to pick up all the questions from people. That was how I heard that somewhere, or I'm trying to get that heard somewhere. When Galileo, and I wasn't there to witness this, but apparently, I'm older, but not that old. Apparently, Galileo invented his telescope to help, basically church armies see over the hill, and he would use the telescope and show them how they could see way far away. And they were like, wow, this is super useful, what a great military weapon. And then when he turned the same telescope upward and said, and guess what, they put him under house arrest and stuff like that. So, we're very curious little creatures. We're perfectly happy to not believe things or to believe whatever. But there's a whole lot of influences on what we believe and what we think. What's funny is my punchline is that trust is the only way out. The only way forward is that we learn how to trust one another again. Behind that, I say we shredded trust. Over the last 300 to 3,000 years, we have destroyed trust. It could get worse. I trust all of you to not throw things at us if we say bad things, right? It could be much worse. We're not at a nadir here yet, but we're really in a very low trust situation with the institutions of life. Edelman Public Relations of all entities puts out a trust barometer every January. 2 Januaries ago, their punchline was global trust implosion, and this year was worse. In particular, of course, the media went down because Trumpismo. So one of my beliefs is that we have a lot of scripts in our heads. We get socialized to these scripts. We're born into a culture or religion or whatever. One of my favorite songs on this subject is from South Pacific. Yes, South Pacific. It's you've got to be carefully taught. Well, look at the lyrics, right? Raise your hand if you know of the song. Excellent. A really good reason to be at CWA, by the way. The Broadway show literacy is far higher than your average conference. So I don't believe that we're born hating the other, capital O, whatever that means. I think scripts are put in our heads, and in fact, I think that what we're witnessing is a gigantic battle over those scripts, right? So who's heard of Frank Luntz? Raise your hand if you know who Frank Luntz is. Awesome. He's basically a word sculptor. He's the guy who helped Reagan and others figure out what words to say in speeches to resonate with the right audience and cause people to vote for them. The words not necessarily having to reflect what the policy things would be later on. This was really done so that you would collect a lot more votes. Who's familiar with Edward L. Bernays? 10% of you, maybe. So Eddie Bernays, not spelled like the sauce, was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, was one of the inventors of public relations back with Ivy Lee back in the day, and basically taught us how to eat bacon for breakfast, for example. One of his clients was the pork board. They had a whole bunch of pork belly left over. What do? Hey, let's convince people instead of eating high on the hog, which is the loin, to go make a mess of fat for breakfast and fry it up. And here we are.
But it's delicious.
And it tastes so good. And now we can't imagine a life before bacon now, right? It's bacon on everything. So there's good and bad about spin. But I'll just give this a dark spin, which is, has anybody seen the documentary Hypernormalization by Adam Curtis? Raise your hand if you've watched Hypernormalization. One person, 2 people in the back, 1 person, 2 people in back here, and they're raising their arms high because you should all go watch this thing. Adam Curtis is a BBC documentarian. He's done 10 or so docs. The first one that I fell in love with way back when was called Century of the Self, which was about the uses of psychology in business and government. The first hour of that 4-part documentary is about Eddie Bernays and how he basically sold us a whole bunch of stuff that is less. He sold us women smoking in public. by creating the Torches of Freedom March back when it was taboo for women, ladies, to smoke in public. He had a bunch of debutantes during the Easter parade in New York suddenly pull out cigarettes and light up. He had warned the press beforehand that something was brewing, and 50% of the population of the country came in as public smokers. How about that? So if you watch hypernormalization, it's sort of a dark thesis, and his thesis is that we are entering in, if we are not already in a nonlinear war, and that in nonlinear warfare, information warfare is much cheaper than bullets and bombs, much cheaper. So one could look at the neutering of science and news over the last 30 years in a very organized effort as an actual effort to create the fog of war and to mystify what's going on. And when people don't know whom to trust or what to trust anymore, they'll pick up whatever narrative they want, or, very likely, whatever narrative their social circle believes in, because being alienated from your social group is about the worst thing that can happen. So people are perfectly happy to deny a lot of evidence if it keeps them in their social group. They'll deny anything. There's a thing called willful blindness. There's a whole bunch of terms for this. Anybody know what behavioral economics is? Have you studied it a little bit? I have an undergrad in economics, mostly econometrics, which I call how to lie with numbers. And when behavioral econ came up finally, I was like, oh my goodness, somebody finally skewered the neoclassical economic model that we are all rational and selfish and trying to get ours, and that turns into these curves that turns into balanced equilibrium and all that, most of which is wrong and broken and a bad way to plan a country. But hey, how do we plan the country? We're the economists. So I actually think that we're already in this nonlinear war, and my big fear right now is that the era of post-truth and fake news and whatever else is not a 3 or 8 year digression, but a 200-year era. Because history travels in great waves, and there's backlash over time. Sometimes you have stability, and I've said in a couple of panels so far that in Egypt, they paint like this for 2,000 years. And it's not because they can't draw or paint naturalistically, it's because that's what culture dictates for 2,000 years. It's not that they're stupid. Go back to the caves of Lascaux and Chauvet and look around. These people could paint perfectly naturalistic animals and humans and whatever. They didn't have perspective drawn with a vanishing point, but boy, those things are it's beautiful art. It's really beautiful art. We don't discover how to suddenly paint, realistic things. So I think that we're at a really important cusp right now because the narrative is scrambled. People are grabbing for whatever narrative makes sense to them or their community believes. Facts are a mess right now, and those of us, and I'll number myself on this side, that believe that we should maybe science the shit out of this and experiment our way toward a better future may well be in the minority coming up unless we can figure out how to communicate with the other, with a capital O, whoever that is. And for the other conversation, I'll point you toward a really nice TED Talk by this journalist named Anand Giridharadas. I can send a link later because it's hard to spell out loud. I'm not sure I could. And he's basically reading an apology letter to the other who has been harmed. And he says, look, I heard you, but I really wasn't listening. I could sort of see what was going on, but I didn't really see what happened. I'm sorry that you've been harmed. I thought this global no barriers world, the scientific world, was going to be good for all of us, and it appears that I was wrong. And so let's talk. I'll stop there.
So this is one of the first panels I actually get to talk about one of the things that's in my profile. I started off as a music major and actually did get my degree in music. I did music all throughout high school and in college, and then I went in the bio says I smoothly transitioned to biochemistry and biophysics, and that was through an immunology lab. So smooth is not really, of course, I'm just joking around with that. So I'm actually, I'm really excited. I get to tell you the story right now about what smoothly means. Okay. So it's the first semester after my senior year, just finished finals. And I realized two things that weekend. One, the girl I had been dating for about 6 months, if I asked her, she would have said yes. We've been married for about 13 years now. And I also figured out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. You know, I had a plan. Oh, I'm going to go to music grad school, you know, just do some composition. I mean, I have a full-on belief that I could have been a professional musician, at least in composition or arranging, band director at a school, something like that. I mean, I was on that particular track. So that's also a lesson out there to parents who, like, you know, have kids in college or high school and they're like confused. I don't know what they're going to do. I didn't figure this out until after the first semester of my senior year. There you go. All right. So how did I figure out I was going to go into science? So I was pre-vet. I worked in a vet hospital. I was no longer pre-vet. You know, but I still took some of those courses like organic chemistry and certain things like that. And, you know, I had a little bit of a scientific, you know, acumen with those particular courses. So, so, you know, kind of apropos to this particular panel is like, you know, believing in ghosts. And I kind of thought about, well, what do you mean by ghosts? Do you mean like the paranormal thing on TLC? Do you mean like angel? Like what do you mean by that? But I'll get into that later, but I at least wanted to tell you about this particular part of the background. So I was actually in church, and I still go to church. I have tithe. You know, I'm very involved in the church in my community. And this was during praise and worship, so it was actually during music, and I heard something say pharmacology. Looking around, I figured out that no one around me had said that word. And you know how you kind of hear some of your internal dialogue and you kind of know how your voice sounds in your head? This wasn't that. So I was in church, so I figured, I guess the Lord's trying to tell me something. So, okay, Lord's trying to tell me to go into science. You know, okay. You sure? Okay, well, all right. So let's kind of fast forward, you know, continue. Okay, so what was the message that day? So, you know, the message is about Elijah telling this woman who was in extreme debt, find every single empty vessel you can find and bring it to this oil spout, and it's basically going to keep pouring out oil until you stop having empty vessels. You're the empty vessel. Okay, so you're saying that if I go to science, from, you know, I'm a music, like, do you know how hard it's going to be to get a job with a music degree in some, okay. Yeah. What's funny is I didn't even get a degree in pharmacology. But it was the word that I needed to hear at that particular time to actually pursue the path of science. And the things that have happened to me, you know, through this career path, I mean, there are so many different things that have come full circle. I've lost count of how many times I've gone around the merry-go-round. But what it has done is it's given me kind of a unique perspective into what's, you know, perceived as this war between religion and war between science. And they actually have a lot of parallels, in my opinion. I think they're both trying to help people. I mean, they're both, well, in the, not the crazy zealot form, but like the, you know, the you know, if you look at, you know, if you're looking at the dude, oh, you know, all about how can we help our, you know, love your brother or your sister, like love our neighbor. I mean, these are like the things that, you know, how can we love them? We can help them. We can help them when they're sick. We can, you know, be, you know, if they're in need, we can actually do things about that. But, you know, it kind of drives me to this, well, how do we marry the two? How do we break down the barrier between the two? Because I do believe that they can actually coexist, but I think a lot of times these two factions are threatened by what each other means. They're saying, well, if I'm right, you can't be. And I don't think that has to be the case. I think both can coexist. I think evolution can coexist with creation. I need to figure it out. Other people need to figure it out. You know, what species was Adam and Eve? Like, oh, were they first home? Like, you know, there are so many questions you can start to ask that, you know, but to just say you're completely wrong because I don't believe you, or your faith is invalid because I have proof. I mean, you can't, that's the very definition of faith. You can't really prove it. You just feel it. And I had to have faith to go into science. And now I'm sitting at this really awesome conference, which is great. But so how do you how do you do that? I think one of the things on why, people kind of, going toward the topic, believing in ghosts versus, believing in Darwin. And, it's I believe what I can understand. I believe what I came up with. And what I will say is constantly challenge your beliefs. I mean, even as a Christian, I constantly try to challenge that. How can I prove myself incorrect? Because in the end, it makes my opinion strong. It makes what I believe stronger. How can I counteract this? And do I have all the answers? Absolutely not. Well, do I have all the answers in science? Absolutely not. Have we cured all the bacteria yet? No. So I think sometimes the burden is on the person giving the message. And I know a lot of times in religion, there's fire and brimstone. A lot of times in science, there's fire and brimstone. And I think we all need to do a better job in communication in that regard. The scientist version of me is saying, okay, well, I'm a public servant because I take federal dollars. How can I serve you by finding a new cure? I mean, that's what I believe that I'm doing. And it comes from this faith-based, like I want to help people part of the Bible with that. I understand that's not how a lot of people get down, and I'm not here to force that down your throat. I'm just here to tell you the story about why I'm doing what I'm doing. But I do think some of the burden is how we explain that, how we speak, because I think that speaks to trust. Not to use it as a tool just to convince somebody, but hey, this is something that I'm passionate about. This is something that I truly believe is correct. And, along that, as far as trust, you can say, okay, well, cite your source. It's like, oh, I had this anecdote about this one person who did this one thing at this one time. Well, where did you get that from? Oh, I heard it from somewhere. Cite your source. But I do think, kind of leading to this whole disconnect between believing in, Darwin, and I think that's really believing in science or believing in pseudoscience. It comes down to the researcher as far as like, how can we communicate better with you? And so if you're interested in finding out more science things, there are lots of different resources that you can read. But again, make sure that the source that you're reading uses good sources. And I'll stop there.
It's interesting, these panels, as I've said, are sort of like intellectual improv, right? Because I'm not even sure what the title means when you come in, So it's interesting the going third here, because there's sort of two ways to interpret this question. The first one is this question of, you could even put it as sort of faith versus science, right? Ghosts, because ghosts are something that is sort of connected with spirituality, and spirituality is connected with religion. And then there's the other topic, which we can discuss here also, which is the role of science in culture. And we've had this enormous rise in denialism over the last few years around particular topics, but it's spread, and that's part of the difficulty. So both of these, let me just address in different ways. So the first question of more people believe in ghosts than believe in Darwin, that doesn't necessarily bother me that much, because the experience of, if somebody says to me and says, I saw a ghost, right? I can't tell you, I wasn't there. I can't say, no, you didn't see a ghost, right? I can explain like, well, I don't believe in ghosts, that tell me what you saw. Maybe it was a trick of the light or whatever. But, I have enough friends who have had experiences of seeing ghosts or feeling a presence that, who knows, right? I mean, I don't believe in ghosts. I'm an atheist. But, who knows how the world is built? I don't believe they exist. But, enough people who I trust, or let me put it this way, who I think are reasonable, rational, they've had some kind of experience. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just the vibe, the tingly vibe. So I'm fundamentally not, worried about people believing in ghosts, because, again, this is sort of, and this also goes to religion. My first book was on science and religion, The Constant Fire, because, I saw the new atheists versus religious fundamentalist debate, which was sweeping the country in the, mid, 10 years ago, as just being like, just sucking all the air out of the room in a topic that really had there's a lot to talk about. Human spiritual endeavor, dating back to the very dawn of what it means to be human, and this process we call science, both arise from this aspiration aspiration to the true and the real and the beautiful, right? And to say that like anybody who has any spiritual inclinations is an idiot is just like, that is so blind and ignorant in terms of its understanding of what religion and what spirituality have been about for human beings, is that there are really interesting conversations we can have. But so I'm not so worried about more Americans believing in ghosts or having said they felt ghosts than Darwin. I'm worried about more Americans, believing in chemtrails, than Darwin. More Americans believing that climate change is a hoax than Darwin. Particularly the climate, or the vaccines, or even now GMOs also, is that, there has been this tribalism that has pulled up many different tribes where people are just willing to ignore science, ignore what the science says because it doesn't fit in with their particular cultural worldview. And this, if you look, it would have been great to have Naomi here because, she tracked in particular how this phenomena occurred, and it was really climate change that started. It was evolution to begin with, but evolution was always kind of marginalized, right? The people who even really cared about the evolution debate were, it was on the edge. But with climate, and what happened with climate is the climate deniers took a page right out of what was going on with evolution. With climate, there was a purposeful, willful attempt to discredit not just the science, but the scientists, right? And what always got me so angry as a science communicator, I write for NPR, I write for the New York Times, was that, were these people really aware of the consequences of this? Because once you start saying, oh, those climate scientists, it's all a hoax, they just want the money. As if climate scientists were, getting Maseratis from their, $150,000 a year over 3 years research grants that paid for students, And so the damage that does, because once you do that, you're on a slippery slope. Because once you say, oh, it's a hoax, those climate scientists are just doing it for personal gain or whatever, then how far is it until we never went to the moon? Oh yeah, that was another government hoax too. Or, it's just as true with vaccines. It's like, oh, those vaccine doctors, they're just tools of the, of the pharmaceutical industry. It's like, no, first of all, again, there's that Lancet article that people keep bringing up over and over again, which has been disproven a million times, and it's still floating around out there. So, there's the one hand, the question about people's experience, and how their experience of truth relates to the truth that science finds, which is very sort of rigorously, exists in a kind of different domain. Then we can talk about those two, what happens in, say, spirituality and human spiritual endeavor and what happens in science. But then there's this other thing which is happening, which is this very much this purposeful erosion of the fact that anything can be true, right? That's happening for a reason. Somebody's got an agenda for doing that. And the damage to not having a shared reality is profound, and we're just beginning to see its consequences. And I believe there's a way out. I really do believe there's a way out. Trust is an important part. Actually talking to people is an important part. And most importantly, because this is what science is about, awe is the answer. Right? If I got to go talk to, a bunch of people about climate science, and I know this is probably going to be a hostile audience, I'll start the first half hour about exoplanets. I'll show them totally cool pictures of Mars, and just for a while, I'm just going to get them like, oh my God, that is so cool. And then I'm going to bring in climate change, right? Because the reason why science resonates in us is beauty and awe and this inherent thing we all have for knowing that our lives are short, we live in a vast universe, and we are surrounded by mystery. Science doesn't take away mystery, it enhances it. And so I do think all is not lost, but we have to really rethink how we approach talking about science with people. So I'll end there.
Would the panelists like to dialogue a little bit, given what you've shared with one another in the audience, or your pleasure?
Let's go with your questions to the audience.
Yeah.
I think we went different directions that are nice and complimentary.
Yeah, and we'll see what people think.
Before we turn to the audience Q&A, I have to make a shameless plug, just to build on Jerry's comments. We did want to mention quickly that, as you know, you may have seen folks walking around with the CWA 70 pins on, right? It's the 70th anniversary of the CWA, and to celebrate that anniversary, There's a crowdfunding campaign has been established to raise $70,000 for the conference. We are a quarter of the way to the goal and would appreciate your support. Any amount helps. You can give by selecting the donate button in your app or visiting the CWA website. So something to think about post-panel. I think the producers might be walking around picking up questions or have a few questions, or if you like a note card, track down a producer. I have just one question here. I'm surprised. So I'll just read it directly. Oh, a student question just literally came in, but we'll go to that one next. Beliefs are a lack of critical thinking. Isn't that essentially the problem? Came from one audience member. Like to take that on?
I can take a quick swing at it. So science is a belief system, right? That's a belief. So you're saying beliefs are a lack of critical thinking. Science and the scientific process are a set of beliefs that proceed with logic and lead to some conclusions. So I worry about when we start thinking about critical thinking as a particular path. Scientism is a word, and we can be overly confident or overly reliant on science as well. Mm-hmm. And then it has weird side effects. So for example, Darwin, you know, I'm intrigued by the title of our session being Ghosts versus Darwin, because to me, survival of the fittest, which isn't really a Darwinian sort of notion but is fit under Darwin, has run over our culture and created the capitalist sort of monster we have right now. Like, would you like it if at lunchtime it was survival of the fittest? Would that work really well for us? Like, not so much, right? And years ago, I decided I was going to be curious for a second about the anarchists, those terrible anarchists. So I read a little bit of Peter Kropotkin, and the first half of his book is all about animal cooperation in nature. He talks about wolves and termites and what. I'm like, wait, this is that hideous, horrible anarchist? What's going on here? So I worry that we sort of lock down on some of these belief systems and we don't sort of question them enough. And we take a lot of things as gospel that aren't gospel with a capital G on the religious side of the aisle, but rather become dogma or gospel on the other side of the aisle. And those are equally dangerous to us if we don't think of them with care.
So I think when people ask, what do you think was going to happen with bacteria, some of the antibiotic resistance? And I say, well, I have hopes, I have expectations, I have beliefs there. And I think sometimes, those kind of transfer to being a dream of helping things, or, it gives you the, I'm going to steal your word. It gives you all of the things that you can kind of accomplish and do. So I think saying that about belief it's a little difficult, because I think that it's something that builds, having belief in certain social constructs actually can build that trust and actually lead to accomplishing more things within the society. And I'll stop there.
I just want to add, like, blind belief is the problem. It's not belief much. It's really blind belief. It's sort of, it's like, okay, here's a scripture, and somebody's going to give you a particular interpretation of the scripture, and you have to take word for word that interpretation uncritically. That's a problem. But as you said, with scientism, there's a way that the ideas of, science can be distilled. Like, there's this whole idea, for example, I have a lot, I've talked before in the panels, that, you are nothing but your neurons, right? You are just a biological computer, right? That is a metaphysical statement that really has nothing to do with science right now, right? But it's said like, well, of course, that's the scientific view. Any other view than that is not scientific. That's like, no, that's scientism. That's a metaphysical belief that gets added on to, to science. And it may, there's lots of ways that could still, that there's lots of scientific ideas that aren't that. So, the real problem is uncritical belief. So I'll just sort of.
Quick reminder that the best way to get a note card, if you're interested in writing a question down, is raise your hand, and the moderators will circle over to you with a note card and pencil for you to write. A little bit of reflection on Jerry's statement, which I think would be interesting for both Michael and Adam to consider as well. thinking a little bit more about Jerry's comment that people will deny almost anything to remain within their social group. What kind of conclusions can we draw from that, or what kind of impact might we foresee from that kind of group behavior?
Sometimes making friends is hard.
It's not easy being green.
Sunny days with the love.
But I think that some of the best conversations I have with people is when we completely disagree. Take my wife, for instance. No. No. Let me actually give you.
This is being recorded.
Oh yeah. So no. We if you take the Myers-Briggs test, in every single category, I am the opposite of my wife in every single one. So we have different arguing styles. We have different ways of being upset. We have different ways of parenting, and we basically had to mesh all these things together and create this, this environment which hopefully our kids don't get screwed up. But we disagree on a lot of things. We disagree on what's the coolest type of television to watch. But what we do is through these discussions and through these disagreements, we become a better team. Those disagreements actually enhance our circle, not destroy it. But I understand that there are a lot of confines that doesn't happen in. I mean, people have had a problem. There are people who have problems leaving Scientology or that whatever they call that place. I'm not even going to call them a church that they, I think it was Westboro or something. And they hold up the sign. They interview people. It's like, no, that was my community. I didn't want to leave that because they were my family. And I think what makes the things stronger in some of these circles is that we not only disagree, but we question, we go deeper, and then we come up with an understanding of where we find common ground even within our disagreements. And I think within that, I think that's something that we need to do more often, not just in religion, but also in science. With my colleagues at work, we disagree about what's the best way to tackle the problem. Well, nice thing about science is sometimes you could just do both experiments and see which one works. Sometimes they both work, sometimes neither one works. But then you move on. You have kind of an answer. Talking about faith and what's the best way to move forward, you can do that as well. And you can still walk away still having your belief. And as long as you don't use that particular piece of information to say, well, you think red is the best color and now you're a horrible person, you're fine. But on the other side of that, you don't want people to have hateful comments either. And that also occurs on both sides. So if you're if you're trying to stay in the circle and it's due to hateful rhetoric, it might be time to find a new circle.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that there are certainly lines you've got to draw, right, about, fascism is a line we're going to draw, about political discourse, in terms of what, we're going to say, like, there are certain places, sorry, you can't go. But most people you're talking to who you disagree with are not fascists, right? They come from a different background. They have different, and I've seen this with climate change, right? I've seen, in my work with climate change. So I was raised in an Italian-Irish working-class neighborhood right across from New York and Jersey, and I was like the Jew in the town, and so I grew up really sort of being the other, but it was a great experience in a lot of ways, except for getting my butt kicked all the time. Other than that, it was great. No, but it was great because I had this amazingly rich and diverse set of experiences that when I finally ended up in academia, that they carried me through. That I had experiences and had grown up in a way that a lot of my colleagues hadn't had that background. So now sometimes when I'm going out and doing climate change talks to people, it's it's not a mystery to understand. They're not other. They're people I grew up with. And so what I found is what you have to really be careful of when somebody says something to me about climate change, when they want to start a fight, right? Do I fight back with them or do I ask a question, right? Now, again, some of these people are just so determined that I am the enemy and they're just going to keep going with it. And then at that point, I'm going to be like, there's just not, like I said, you're being kind of hostile and I don't really want to have a conversation.
Bandwidth.
Yeah, right. But there's I'll give you an example. I was at dinner with some folks, and there was a guy who was like, he had a flooring company, and he said, we were talking about climate. He's like, oh, you do climate. Climate's changing all the time. And I could have ripped him a new one, right? Because that is like, that is one of the dumbest statements, right? But he wasn't one of these guys who was coming at me with his fists up. It was just something he'd heard from his buddies or whatever talk show he listens to, and I was able to just talk to him about it. I was like, hey man, do you know how long? And, I didn't quiz him. I just talked to him, and by the end, we'd had this really cool conversation over beers about science and climate and this and that. Now, whether or not, when, the next day when he was talking to his buddy, he was like, hey, you know what? Climate change is actually happening. I don't know if that happened. But all I know is that, we had talked as human beings. And this is actually one of the biggest problems, I think, for science in the country, is that most people have never met a scientist. There's this great poll I saw when people said, what are the attributes of scientists? And they trusted scientists, but they said, scientists don't value human beings the way others do. And I was like, this is clearly from every science fiction movie you've ever seen, where Bill's a scientist, but he doesn't connect well with human beings. So it was so obvious they never met a scientist. And so I think actually one thing we really have to do as a community is figure out how to get out of our, blue state, or blue cities, and get out and just talk to people so they can see oh, you're a scientist. Yeah, right. You don't have an evil lair, So I think that would go a huge, long way.
Mm-hmm. So briefly on the same question, just to take it a little more concrete for an example, and then a little bit of a riff on what my panel colleagues were just saying. We've seen politically this whole outgroup thing play out over the last 30 years. And in particular, I think the Gingrich Revolution of 1994, Gingrich instituted message discipline, and he basically made sure that people were not talking across the aisle. Senators and Congress critters used to dine together, exercise together. They used to rent homes together on Capitol Hill because they were usually in their districts. And he made sure that never happened and that they were never caught negotiating. They then, the right of this country then did a lot of gerrymandering. There was a lot on the left as well, but they made it so that Republicans fear primaries, not general elections, because so many districts are safe on one side or the other, right? And so ostracism became, if you don't toe the line and stick with all of our messages, you will get no primary funding, and then you simply won't get reelected and you won't be here. So this is a very pragmatic series of forces and threats and rewards and so forth to keep everybody in line. And we saw this play out very, very weirdly during the recordings of Donald Trump saying really inappropriate things, where 2 days later, half of his party had abandoned him, and a week later they were all back on the bus, practically speaking. And they managed somehow to overlook what was going on for other reasons. And I can give you a lot of narrative for why I think Trump won, which was not that all the people who voted for him are racist, homophobic, whatevers, because I think a lot of people wanted to break the system. There's a lot of people who saw that the current system wasn't actually working. So I think the message discipline is an example of this dynamic playing out. And I've had a couple conversations just in the last 3 weeks. I went to the Never Again March and spent the first 30 minutes talking to a gun rights protester of the march. And my dad taught me how to shoot. My dad used to load his own ammo. I know way too much about military history. We had a very nice conversation, and I don't think either of us convinced each other to go out the next day and say, oh my God, they're right. And then just this Monday, I had a conversation where we started getting into interesting waters, and so I turned to the gentleman and I said, so do you like Jordan Peterson, who is a Toronto psychologist who's gotten huge attention recently? David Brooks wrote an article about this. This is the era of Peterson. He is the best philosopher on the right. And that opened up an interesting conversation, because when I said that, his eyes just lit up, and he said, yes! And I was like, well, okay, I know enough about Peterson to have this conversation.
A couple student questions might be variants of the theme of this one, which is, how would you hopefully respectfully engage in conversations with someone who believes in pseudoscience or a flat earth or any of those kinds of things, and have constructive conversation and dialogue with those folks?
Yes, it is hard. You get more flies with honey. I think that a lot of our approaches are I'm right, you're wrong, and that just doesn't work. I think we have to speak to people as they are people. We can't just We can't be speaking down to people. When we're talking about our science, we can't talk down about our science. We can't dumb it down. Like, these are all things that we shouldn't be trying to do. We should be telling you the coolest thing possible. We should want you to be on the edge of your seat talking about a specific protein. We should be,
Can you pull that off?
Sure, let's try it.
All right.
And if you've heard this before, don't shout out the answer. There's a compound, or there's something that we've used since antiquity to kill bacteria. There's something, and the same thing, we use it today. We spray it on crops, and we've protected our vineyards. We protect it against the potato blight. We can use it in hospitals and cut down 80% on hospital-acquired infections. Your body already uses this to kill bacteria, but we don't understand how it works. This is a real thing I'm talking about. This is actually what my lab studies. And I'll just stop there.
That's me.
Scientists need to become storytellers.
Yeah.
There you go.
Right? It's copper, actually. And that's what my lab studies. We try and do things. But, kind of going to this thing, we have to instill awe. We have to instill wonder. We have to make you crave the next statement. And we need help doing that because not all scientists are built like that.
Right.
But you can't go to somebody and just bang their head against the wall. But at the same time, as scientists, we don't have the bandwidth to go to talk to every single person. And has anyone heard of sea lioning? Anybody? Wow.
Stump. They're stumped.
I win. I got for your hands.
I don't think it's in my brain either.
Okay, sea lioning, I saw this, and it's basically somebody asking you questions just to annoy you, and it's like, and then all of a sudden, you get annoyed back with, it's like, look, I'm just trying to find out information here. Have you heard of Google?
Right.
But, we have to be careful, and we encounter people like that, and so how do you basically defend yourself against that? You just have to you have to learn how to be you have to become that storyteller. You have to figure out who's the group of people that I can move the needle with the most. Because there are some people with climate change, as you're saying, that it's just never going to work. There are some people with vaccines, and that's like one of my biggest soapboxes. How many millions of dollars have gone into trying to disprove something that was already found false, and how many more cures we could have found in the process using that money, your money? Yes, because that's your money. Sorry. But yeah, we have to change the way we speak to people. We can't be talking down. And I'll stop rambling.
It's an interesting thing because sometimes, I get angry, right? So, Carl Sagan was my hero when I was growing up, both because he was an astronomer, but I read his books and I loved his books. I loved the breadth of his books. And so that was one of the reasons I started writing, writing about science. And the thing about Carl Sagan was that no matter who he was talking to, he was always kind. He never really talked down to anybody, And I find myself trying to emulate that and sometimes failing, right? Because sometimes, people, especially now, people are so polarized and people are so angry. And sometimes, I have thought, maybe there should be a science license, So somebody, they go into the hospital and they're like, oh, my arm's all messed up. I need to do an MRI. It's like, well, we'll give you that MRI, but first fill out this form that sees whether or not you, agree that 97% of all climate scientists, say the climate is changing, okay? Because if not, you're not getting the MRI, okay? What do you think about that, pal? When I think about that, I even was going to write about this, like a scientist should go on strike, What?
I like it. Hold the tech for ransom.
Well, that's what I was. It's like, sorry, everybody's cell phone is going off for 3 days until we stop the stupidity, And then, once we sign up on the Paris Accord again, we'll turn the cell phones back on. But, I think, that's the wrong approach, as much as it would be really satisfying.
Sounds like a good movie, though.
Yeah, right. So there's a line we have to draw, especially when the people who know better. That's what angers me. It's the people who know better. The people who have people have a vested interest in doing this. They're not doing it just because, right, their community, that's in general what they hear when they listen to Rush Limbaugh or something. But the people who are actually driving, like Rush Limbaugh, those people are responsible, right? Because they know better, and they're doing this because they have some other agenda, financial, political, whatever. But for most people, we got to figure out, when we're dealing with most people, is to make them part of our communities, right? Make them recognize that we're part of their communities. And that may be a long road, but it's the establishing trust. And that's, I think, the thing.
I just want to add one sentence. One of the big questions in my mind is, how do we hold discourse when some people in the arena are trying to break discourse?
Yeah.
How do you stay in discourse? How do you stay patient and polite?
Yeah.
How do you stay there? Because some people have determined that it's their strategy to break discourse and that they're going to win that way.
Do you have an answer for that? Can I just ask you, do you have?
I think you were both going right towards it, like respect and openness and all of those things. And I think at some point, patience and working through it. But I don't know. This is the great danger right now.
Yeah.
A question, one from an audience member, also a student, kind of building off, Adam, your comment around scientists are real people too. So they also can make mistakes, so they're not infallible. What can we do as a society to ensure that we can trust scientists and feel that there is trust in the work that they're doing and the results and the research that they're doing? And then what role is there for the media to play or other sources of information sharing to play in getting the word out and spreading scientific knowledge?
Can I start on this one?
Yes, absolutely.
Just because, so next week I have a thing I did with NPR, an interview, with Ari Shapiro and I talking about this because, the most important thing for people to understand is not what science says, but how science works. Right? Because that's the big gap. And the media has been terrible about this, right? Because it's like every day it's a new study says if you drink motor oil every day, you'll live 10 more years. And you're like, what? Where did this thing come from, right? There's no distinguishing about the fact that, the most recent study in a scientific journal is not the last word on anything. So part of this is the real work that scientists have to do and also holding the media account to start talking about how the process that science works. And so this question about holding, about dealing with science and its mistakes, well, the great thing I think that science can do is show its mistakes, right? To show this process where, so like the coffee thing, right? Coffee gives you cancer. Coffee doesn't give you cancer. Coffee gives you cancer. To show look, we know what that really shows you is we don't know what's going on, right? Coffee stuff, we just don't know whether or not coffee gives you cancer, so you probably go ahead, have that cup. But Newton's laws, yeah, we got that nailed, right? Or climate, did we change the climate? Yeah, we changed the climate. The most basic parts of that, yeah, we absolutely know that. So it's part of, the most important thing here is for scientists to be transparent about when they've made mistakes, and for the media to start giving scientists, and I'll tell you, I've had trouble with this as someone who talks to the media, allow us to do the full accounting. Not just tell you about the most recent result, but how I reached that result, how the community reached that result. One of the dumbest things I ever hear is science is not about, there's no consensus in science. Consensus has nothing to do with science. Anybody who says that has never worked in science. How do you decide where to put your money for the next big experiment? You got to get together with a bunch of people and agree. So, I think there's a huge amount of messaging. We can always say, oh, scientists need to do better. It's true. But, the scientists need to start, and the public needs to hold the science, the media accountable. Tell us the whole damn story. So,
I actually want to tell you a little bit about how I publish science, because I don't know if a lot of people actually know that particular mechanism. So we have a scientific concept, we have a hypothesis, we test it, that part you're probably familiar with. So we write up everything that we did, what we think of it. We present the data after we've repeated them and gotten significant results to support our conclusion. We publish our methods. Some people publish more than others. And then we send it to a journal. That journal, in turn, sends it out to a number of experts in the field. So it's not like it just goes right into existence. We can actually pre-publish things, but it's a big, bold, big statement that says, this has not been peer reviewed. No, we peer review our own things, because if one of us looks bad, then we all look bad. I mean, going back to the vaccine statement, that took scientists, it took us back so much in the fight of trying to get people to get vaccinated. So when one of us makes a egregious mistake like that, we're all just like, wow, we need to make sure that this is absolutely correct. So it goes out to 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 or 5 different reviewers who all say, did you do this control experiment to make sure that you didn't do it right? What about this control? What about this control? Well, I have this paper. You need to cite that. Well, that person might be pompous. But, you know, there's a lot that goes into that. And the same thing happens on the grant side of things. We have a scientific idea, and we are trying to put it out there to say, please give us money so that we can study this. Well, you need more preliminary data. Well, that's why I'm trying to get a grant, because I'm trying to get the money to get the data. Sorry, again. But when I write something called an R01, that's kind of the major mechanism of biomedical funding through the National Institutes of Health. It goes to a panel of 30 people that they discuss, and they give it a score and a priority score. Now, in your mind, and you think of, you know, the problem that I just introduced to you today as far as the copper thing, how many grants do you think should get funded as a percentage of the people actually submitting them? You don't have to shout it out, but just come up with an idea of that number in your head. 100%, 50%, 1%, 20%. What's your number? Oh, here, 10. Yeah, we can't be friends now. You're out the circle, man. You're out the circle. No. But that's the actual number, though. I mean, it's somewhere in the teens, right? So we are extremely, I say that to say we are extremely critical on each other in how we present data, how we get access to do those particular studies, because we're trying to protect the craft of science itself so that misinformation does not get out.
A great segue to another student question, which also builds a little bit on Jerry's comments at the beginning around the issue of trust. Well-documented decline of institutional trust within American society, certainly, as compared to interpersonal trust. So what can we do to ensure that arguments from authorities, from the institutions, say the scientific institutions, how do we ensure that arguments from authority from individuals, say well-known individuals, people in positions of authority, don't trump logic from institutions which have perhaps rigor and standards that they apply to their logic that's disseminated to society?
Did they use the word Trump intentionally?
They did use the word, I don't know, it's not capitalized, but.
Just saying.
Yeah.
I think this is sort of a long-term battle over history in some sense. Some people believe in the great man theory of history, where individuals come up with brilliant ideas or take over governments or win wars or whatever, and they shape the direction of history, whoever they are. And other people think that history just sort of rolls along and people are bumped up, and then history kind of records some of them as great heroes, but that it wasn't really one individual who shifted all this. And then somewhere in the background, ignored by everybody, are the institutions, because it's such a boring word, institutions. And in the panel I just came from, we were all of us saying, hey, students here at CU Boulder, go study institutions and how to remake them, because we really, really need you to design better institutions. My own take on this is that our institutions at present are all designed from mistrust of the average person. And in doing so, they cut away the genius that's in the room, they create scarcity where there's abundance, they do a lot of completely stupid things. So I think it's a mix. I think sometimes the institutions are all wrong, sometimes the individuals are all wrong. I don't know that I would put one above the other, because I've seen plenty of institutional stupidity. Most of America's wars have been very stupid. Yeah. There's a book titled Overthrow, written several years ago, that describes the 54 times we've sent our military to overthrow other governments, starting with Queen Kamehameha in Hawaii, going on to the Shah of Iran, whom we placed, and replacing Mossadegh in Iran. We do really stupid things all the time, and that's a really big institution we're supposed to trust.
When these questions sometimes come up of what can we do, ... Let me just say absolutely the most important thing. The first obvious thing is vote, right? But as somebody said in one of the panels I was on before, a student was like, look, people have been telling me to vote since I was 13. Come on, stuff's going on now. it's not just about voting. You got to get involved in the process from the ground up, right? Every week you can go to your town hall meeting. You know, every week you can go figure out, if you're a Democrat, who are the Democrats going to be putting up to vote in the next election? Get involved with that process. Like, really what we have to do is, it's not just showing up to vote once a year. We've got to reapply ourselves to the foundations of the democratic process starting on the local level, school board, town board, local county legislature, all the way up. Really, more than anything else, if we really want to change what's going on, that's the only way. Okay, and there is something to do every week. You don't have to wait until November 2nd to do that. So just when it comes to these kinds of questions, I would say, and this applies to me too, you know, I'm now like, oh yeah, I got to go to my county ledge, you know, and I've started going to those meetings. I've tried to force myself to find the time. This next election cycle that's coming up, some friends and I have gotten together, and we're looking at all of the swing congressional districts in New York, the ones that we think we have the best chance of affecting, and we're going to do some house parties to try and, you know, get money for we're identifying who the candidates in the primaries we want to support. So, you know, all of these questions of what can I do, really, fundamentally, it's about the levers of power, right? I mean, we've got to sort of get the levers of power back to people who believe in science. First thing you ask, you know, the potential candidate you're talking to on the Tuesday night when there's a candidate meet is like, what's your feeling about climate change? What's your feeling about local preparation for climate change? You know, and if they're not on board, what about vaccines? If they're not on board, say, yeah, thank you very much, I'm giving the check to the next person, you know? So that's really, we all have a huge amount of power on that level, and then we'll work our way up to the presidency. But, you know, this is really, I think that's what everybody has recognized. Our fundamental institutions are under threat, and the place to start is not at the White House. The place to start is your town hall. So.
I just want to add something to what Adam just gave us. You sort of went through the usual suspects of democratic process, the town hall, the community meeting, and so forth. There's a whole bunch of other really interesting things happening online and in other kinds of formats. And if it has deliberative or participatory in front of it, very likely it's one of these interesting movements. So there's participatory budgeting, there's all sorts of deliberative discourse and, you know, stuff going on. There's a web service called Lumio that lets people make collective decisions and discuss them. There's 50 other kinds of discourse online where you can share evidence and reflect your position. I think there's something called liquid democracy that's picking up in several countries in Europe. In Taiwan, there's a group called PDIS that's busy implementing a lot of these things to change democracy in Taiwan. So we sometimes lack imagination for how to go have this effect and connect together and reweave the fabric of society and make collective decisions. People all over the world are doing really great experiments, some of which are being mirrored in our country, some of which have started here.
An observation from an audience member, but which I think works here, is, okay, how effective can those strategies be, and are they enough in light of the fact that there are, in some cases, whole movements that are intentionally playing dirty, casting unreasonable doubt on science and scientists? Are these strategies enough to overcome those kinds of forces, those kinds of threats?
Yes.
I believe they are.
Ask us in 100 years.
What a great range of answers. Yeah, everything's a bet. Everything's a bet on the future, right? You know, the history is not linear and it is not deterministic. So, you know, another answer is they better be, right? So, but all you can do is what you can do, and you got to do it. And that's really, you know, we are called upon, right? I always talk to my students about the Lord of the Rings, the fundamental lesson of the Lord of the Rings, right? Did Frodo want the ring? No, these were difficult times. Somebody had to carry the ring. Well, we all got to carry the ring right now. So, how's that for a nerd culture?
I suddenly feel a great weight of responsibility on my shoulders.
Yeah.
My precious.
My precious.
We have about 5 minutes left. Appreciate all of the questions around climate change. We're in Boulder, and it's great to see a lot of people connected and understanding the impacts of climate change. So a lot of questions around, you know, what do we do about deniers, politicians that are deniers, when it's based on ideology, not because of intellectual disagreements. How do you proceed when someone says, well, the climate is always changing, the point you made, Adam? I mean, any thoughts in general about how to address the climate denial movement and things that regular folks can do to take that on in light of the crushing moral imperative of that?
Well phrased. I have a small thought to put before I'll hand it over to people who have done more about climate than I by far, which is ecology and economics both come from the Greek root oikos, which is the household. So they're both about the management of the household. Economics and ecology both come from the same root. So what's up with that? Why do we perceive them as being almost in diametrical conflict? Why do we think that they're opposites? I think that in economics, we think the household is me and my immediate nuclear family. We're involved in a zero-sum game against your family and your family and your family and your family, and we're busy kind of duking it out so that we don't die poor and alone. And that there's this other belief on top of that, a script that if we all act in our own selfish best interest, it'll all work out, which feels like a leap of faith to me, just saying. In ecology, we think the house is at least the planet, if not beyond. And we're kind of cognizant that, hey, if we mess up this rock, we're in trouble. Now, there's a bunch of really wealthy people out there who are putting up private space missions, and a very big belief of many of theirs, I think they will agree with this statement, is that we've screwed up this rock. We need to populate some other rocks so that the human race will survive beyond us. That's the motivation for some of these private space projects. And I gotta say, I hate that motivation. I'd like to save this rock. And I think that if we figure out a way to start seeing the bigger house together, we might actually have economic models that work for all of us in a generative way. And I know a bunch of my friends are working on those kinds of models. You know, generative economics is a term now, or the regenerative economy also. So things like that.
So I think, the way I've worked a lot on this, I just wrote a book on it. The way to subvert the usual, it's about climate in particular, right? With climate, we've got this totally stalled debate. The climate debate, which is, of course, not even a debate because all the scientists, there hasn't been a debate for, 30 years. But so how do we, break that loggerhead? And my answer is aliens. And you're like,
nice.
Because so this is what my thesis is that, look, the story we're telling about climate change is all wrong. Right? We think it's a debate between Republicans and Democrats, or business interests and environmental interests, or it's the evil human race, which is a plague upon the planet, versus the pristine and virginal earth, and all of those narratives. First of all, those narratives are actually from the astrobiological point of view. If you look at Earth as a planet among literally 10 billion trillion habitable planets in the universe, then you take a totally different understanding of what's happening to us. And as I like to say, you can't solve a problem until you understand it, and you can't understand a problem until you can tell its story. And so I will just very briefly tell you what I think the story of climate change is. It is not a story of human greed and evil. It is not a story of a species destroying its environment. In fact, it's otherwise. The true story of climate change is a planet that is becoming self-aware, self-awake. Right? So it's awakening. Human beings are a product of the biosphere. We are what the biosphere is doing now. The biosphere used to do dinosaurs. That was the thing for a while. Then it was grasslands. Right now, it's a technological civilization. And I will not go through the arguments, but we are almost certainly not the first time this has happened. Not the first time a biosphere has produced a technological civilization. And you know what? If your biosphere does that, you should expect climate change. There's almost no way to avoid it. If you are going to create a world-girdling civilization that uses hundreds of terawatts of energy, of power, then, yeah, the planet's going to notice. It's going to kick back. We didn't do this on purpose because we're evil. We did this just as a result of what we do, which is building civilization. And in that sense, a city is no different, is no less natural than a forest. So what really the story is about cosmic winners and losers. This has happened most likely many times before. And the question is, when a species triggers an Anthropocene, when it triggers this kind of thing that's happening to the planet, is it smart enough to guide itself and the biosphere to come into some kind of cooperative relationship with the biosphere into a different planet, true, planetary state. So why this is useful is it completely confounds climate deniers. If you go to my website, if you just do adamfrank.com, you'll see something we did for the Science March, which was like 10 ways to confound your climate-denying uncle. Because now, here's the thing, you know what? Climate change is not our fault, And, you say that to a climate denier, like, that's my line. And you're like, yeah, because, we didn't, like, get oil and we're like, oh, great, we have oil, now let's destroy the planet with it. It was just, we found this stuff, which was useful, And we didn't know at the time that it was going to have these consequences. We built a civilization on it. Oops. All right, now it's going to be our fault if we don't recognize climate change. So sometimes when I talk to climate deniers, I'll be like, so, you hate the human race. They're like, well, what are you talking about? You're the ones who hate the human race. I'll be like, no, climate change shows how powerful we are, how great our business is. We have changed the atmosphere of an entire planet. Go humanity, And, but now, if, now we have to use all the creativity in our business and our, all our creativity and solve the problem. So there's just a lot of ways that if you take this different view, if you don't see humanity as a plague upon the planet, then you can upend the usual dichotomy. And you get a whole new mythic narrative for what human beings are on the planet, which to me is very, very hopeful. So I won't go much longer than that.
Any final comments for the panelists? Good. I did want to let everyone know that although Naomi couldn't be here this afternoon, her film, Merchants of Doubt, is showing this evening at 7 p.m. at the Visual Arts Center, room 1B50. So you can get a sense and flavor of her work if you can attend the film this evening. A big round of applause and thanks for our panelists, and thank you, audience.
Pharmacology.